Still sticking with canola, but in this case, starting to look at the nutrition side of it, and simply some of the work that was done last year looking at nitrogen, sulfur and phosphorus management. Aims are pretty simple. Firstly, canola really is still an expanding crop in the north. There are still a lot of questions in terms of the responses to some of these macronutrients, so we're looking to generate some more data there. And the second one is a question that comes up time and time again. Is there anything we can do in terms of trying to stabilise the percentage oil we're getting in our canola? What you can see there, 4 trials that were conducted. We collaborated with New South Wales DPI under Matt Gardner's leadership. The first 2 sites there at Moree and Blackville, 4 different rates of nitrogen, 4 different rates of sulfur, every combination of those, all with a background of 20 units of P, and over 2 different varieties. So there's a huge amount of data behind it. With the 2 trials that NGA conducted, Yalleroy and Ballatta, 3 different rates of nitrogen, 3 different rates of sulfur, again, every combination of those with 20 units of P under them. But we also had a smaller number of treatments where we had no P applied as well, so we could get an indication of the P response. Straight into yield, and what's more important than looking at the yield initially is what did we start with? Okay, so at Blackville we had very low levels of soil nitrate, 25, and you can see at Moree a bit higher but still fairly low. That was very common in 2012. So we've started off on low end sites. That's the sort of nitrogen response that was seen at those 2 sites. Couple of things to point out. Obviously here are the increasing rates of nitrogen or units of nitrogen in kilos per hectare. What you can see at both sites is a significant yield response even up to that top rate. So at both of those sites, even the highest rate they had was still significantly higher yielding than the second highest rate. Very responsive sites. And the second thing, which you will probably pick up quite clearly, going from no nitrogen applied to the upper rate, in both cases resulted in a doubling of yield. So even though I wouldn't have said it was such a conducive year for big fertiliser responses, we were getting massive nitrogen responses coming through. With the NGA trials, in terms of starting point, Yalleroy 30, Ballatta a bit better, up around 70 units. Not quite as dramatic because we don't have a 0 point, so you don't get that initial response. But what you can see from our low rate of 34 units of N being applied, we were getting a significant jump up to 84 at both of those sites. The only difference here, instead of that yield response continuing to go up, we'd basically reached the plateau at that second rate. So key thing there, it's pretty simple. All 4 of those sites in that sort of year were very nitrogen responsive. Okay, so that was the nitrogen side of it. What happened with sulfur? You can see down here the results we were getting from a KCl40 test. Generally 3 to 5 in that 0 to 15, still fairly low levels down to 60 centimetres, and not surprisingly some bulges at depth. That's what came through in terms of yield response to the sulfur. Just a straight line, absolutely no response. There was no need to apply sulfur with those sort of background levels in the soil. Even though historically we'd say they were probably deficient sites for sulfur for canola production. Phosphorous was the other key one we looked at, and at both the NGA sites, you can see Yalleroy was certainly on the low side, fair chance of getting some sort of response. A little bit less likely at Ballatta, with certainly a higher coal well. Fewer treatments involved here. We only had 6 different treatments, but what you can see coming through, significant yield response at Yalleroy and also at Ballatta, between 1/4 and maybe half a tonne. In summary, in terms of the yield, very simple. Extremely responsive to nitrogen at all 4 sites. At the sorts of levels of sulfur we had in the system there, and the DPI tried to find sites which were low in sulfur. Certainly no sign of any response. For those of you who are interested, no interaction between nitrogen and sulfur. So that means it didn't matter whether you had low, medium or high levels of N, you weren't getting any value or kick from the sulfur. And then obviously we were getting smaller but still significant and useful phosphorus responses at both Yalleroy and Balata. So that's the yield side of it. The flip side is in terms of looking at oil content. There are the DPI results from Moree and Blackville, and what you can see very clearly, significant reductions in oil as those nitrogen rates go up. That's what we saw in our 2 trials. We got that same pattern at Balata. In this case, we had about a 3% drop in oil from a very low level to a high level of N. The DPI trials were around 1.5 to 2%. But we didn't pick up any effect at Yalleroy in terms of change in oil with nitrogen addition. Sulfur, carbon copy of what we saw in terms of yield, had absolutely no impact. Phosphorus, a little bit the same. First thing you should focus on, there was no significant difference at either of those sites. Certainly no pattern, no trend in the site that Rachel had at Yalleroy. At Balata, although there's no significant difference, what we did seem to be finding at the low nitrogen rates, we were getting about 0.75% higher oil. Once we got to high N levels, that difference had basically gone. Looking through some of the literature, it's not unusual to find some sort of oil response to phosphorus, but just as frequently you get no response, and nearly as frequently you can get it going negative. So it was a real response, I think, but it's not something that we can actually plan or budget on. Oil content summary, very clearly, as those nitrogen rates go up, our proteins increase. I haven't put the data up here, so our proteins are going up, our oil goes down at the same time. Nothing happening at all in terms of sulfur when we had that sort of background level in the soil. And no significant response to P, even though there were some interesting things happening at Balata. And I suppose the key point here, if we're trying to help stabilise those oil contents in canola, I'm pretty comfortable that playing around with these macronutrients is not going to be a major way of managing it. Something like the windrowing timing certainly looks a lot more important in terms of trying to ensure we're getting better oil contents. Okay, so what does all that mean for the grower in terms of the real benefits? I've put this together in a slightly different way where across this x-axis is the total crop available in kilos per hectare. So that's what the plant's looking at. It's not looking at how much you've added, it's going how much was there to start with plus what you've added. This is just the data from Moree, and we're looking here in dollars profit per dollar cost. So that dark line is the break even. Above that you're making a profit, below it you're actually making a loss. The first 40 units of N that was applied, you're getting over $2 profit back for every dollar you spent. Not a bad return. The next 40 units, you're getting about $1 profit for every dollar you spent. Still not too bad. The last 40 units, even though you're still getting a significant yield increase, and you actually had the highest net benefit, you're only getting about 25 or 30 cents profit for every dollar you spent. Now, in my book, there's probably a lot of things you'd be better off spending the money on than cranking up the nitrogen to that sort of rate. Looking at that, I think you start to see where that break-even point in terms of value from the nitrogen was at Moree. If I put the data from all the other sites, they've basically all crossed this sort of break-even line in much the same area. And what's coming through, all of those trials were having yield potentials of about 1.5 to 2 tonnes per hectare. Under those sort of conditions, where we needed to be was 120, 160 units of N in total between what was in the soil to start with plus what we've applied. Less than that, we were getting good returns on the dollar invested. If we started going past that, excessive levels of nitrogen, we were still getting extra yield, but we weren't getting good value back on those dollars. In summary, for the Moree and Blackfield sites, because we had a 0N, or because the DPI had a 0N, we were seeing $120 to $200 per hectare profit or net benefits from adding nitrogen, even in a year like 2012. The highest return on investment was when you got a little bit below that 120 kilos per hectare in total. That's when you're getting more bang for your buck. The phosphorus story wasn't as dramatic, but certainly was still significant, and we were getting useful benefits in the order of $30 to $90 per hectare, and nothing at all from the sulfur applications. The sulfur one was what led into some of this work, and Morris Street from Grains Arana Alliance in central New South Wales has been working on this for a couple of years, and we've basically followed on in his footsteps to some degree. One of the things we actually did was analyse the grain from both the Yalleroy and Ballatta trials, where we had the different rates of sulphur, all with the high background of nitrogen and phosphorus, so we didn't have a deficiency from those others impacting on the uptake. When we looked at the nitrogen levels that came through in the grain, we're sitting around 41, 42 kgs. Most of the literature would say 35 to 40 is pretty standard. So we're at the upper end of normal. Phosphorus, very much at that normal rate. If you look at sulphur, we're down at about 4.5 kilos per tonne of grain, which is exactly what Morrie saw a couple of years ago. The interesting one here, when you start to go through the literature, in WA, in some Canadian papers, they all talk about 4 to 5 or even less. Quite commonly, you see in other literature a figure of 10, and that's what most of the recommendations have been based on. Question here, what it's showing is somewhere we need to revisit these sulphur removals, because it looks pretty clear that we're only taking out about 5 kgs per tonne of grain. It's still important to canola, that's more than we're taking off in our wheat, but it may be about half of what we were expecting in the past. What that also means is that soil threshold or budgeting needs to be re-examined, which is basically what we saw in those trials. At 4 milligrams per kilogram in the soil, we couldn't get any response. And so the response level or the threshold level is probably a lot lower than we've been expecting. Finally, pretty clear from all that work, nitrogen and to a lesser extent phosphorus were the key nutrients driving yield and driving the economic benefit. And that's exactly what Morrie had been seeing over about 11 different trials over 3 years. Increasing your nitrogen rates is certainly going to be useful from a yield point of view. It will reduce oil content, but the improvement in economics from that yield increase is far outweighing that reduction in economics from the oil decrease. So we might be losing $7, $14, $20 per hectare because of the oil loss. We're gaining $50 to $100 because of the yield side of it. And that's very common in the literature. The other thing that was encouraging, the data that's come through from all those 4 trials generally supports the southern rule of thumb that's been used for many years, in that you probably need around 80 kilograms per hectare of N for each tonne of canola you're targeting. Now, to put that in simple terms, if you're targeting a 2 tonne per hectare sort of potential, you probably need about 140, 160 units between what's in the soil and what you're applying. If you're chasing 3 tonne, it's probably going to be in that early 200s, which I think marries in with a lot of the commercial experience as well. And the final one there, quite clearly this sulphur requirement urgently needs to be revisited, because it's not so much of an issue, I don't think, in the north, where we've really struggled to get those responses, but certainly in central New South Wales, A lot of growers have taken the message that we've got to focus on sulphur first and everything else is secondary, whereas in fact in terms of economics, probably nitrogen has been the main driver, maybe phosphorus, and sulphur perhaps third in line.
Richard, would you care to comment on in-crop applications of nitrogen and perhaps that's impact on oil?
Look, I'd have to say I'm very low on the experience curve in canola nutrition. Canola is generally a crop where that in-crop application of N is quite efficiently taken up. And certainly that's a very common practice the further south you go. It's also one where an in-crop application of sulphur can be useful. You know, with what we're seeing, the sulphur side of it is probably much lower in risk and concern. Even if it is, we've probably got the tools to come in crop and apply. I would expect you're going to see that same pattern in terms of oil response. It's probably coming through, from what I can see, 60–80% of situations. As you boost the nitrogen, you'll boost yield, you'll boost the grain protein, but the trade-off is your oil content will be coming down. And I don't think it will matter whether it's pre-crop or in-crop. Yeah. You know, you might get benefits from a soil moisture and a canopy management point of view, and a cash flow point of view as well.